Who struggles with math? Okay, yeah, it's pretty normal. Just curious. Yeah, there we go. Good. Someone says, concerned for me, but I'm taking lots of practice exams, and that is certainly the best thing to do, just in general. But math is just all about repetitions. Math is like the weight room, really. It's not super complicated calculus. It will never get harder than that whole T formula concept. So it really becomes a matter of how do you apply the T formula. If math is a struggle, then I find that people kind of gravitate toward that formula, that T or circle formula concept. Some of you kind of math may be second nature, and you might just kind of be bored or annoyed by the T formula, and I get that too. But we talk about them both, so it just depends on what your comfort level is. There we go. And so I would suggest for those who are struggling with math to make a list. Make several pages, just keep track, depending on whichever the calculation is. There's the T formula for it. We did a good bit of math in the finance section. We're going to do a good bit of math in the closing section. Catching up on the chat there. Yeah, and it really is, it's essentially this concept. There we go. It's essentially this idea of something times something else equals something else, and knowing what goes where is going to help you understand what the calculation needs to be. So this concept, we knew that loan amount times interest rate gives us annual interest. And although it's unrelated, the relationship is the same. First of all, don't forget a rate is always one of the bottom numbers. And when it comes to taxes per year, wow, there we go. The tax value times the tax rate equals the annual taxes. So whether it's annual interest or annual taxes, there's going to be a bigger number on the bottom times a rate to get a smaller number, a number that's smaller than that one on the bottom. So understanding the relationship might help you remember, and might even help you formulate your own circle formula in the moment on the test. So that could come in handy. Still moving windows around. Okay, there we go. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the handful of calculations that the closing attorney paralegal does when determining how much money everybody's going to get at closing. And the biggest one that's a point of confusion for people is prorating for taxes. So let me just start there, and then we'll come back around and go to pick up where we left off the other night. While we're still fresh, let's talk about some math. Early in the time together. So, when it comes to property taxes, one of the many calculations that the closing attorney is going to do is to figure out how to make the taxes fair, right? Who pays between the buyer and the seller, how do we determine who pays their fair share, right? So if we have a beginning of the year to the end of the year here, I'm rhyming all over the place tonight for some reason. So January 1st, December 31st, that's our given year, calendar year. For your purposes, don't forget, we'll just say December 30th because every month has 30 days for our pre-licensing class. Now, there's a very important date in the year, and that date is September 1st, because that's the date that taxes are able to be paid. And what I mean by that is, even if you're one of those types of responsible people who pay all their bills early, if you want to pay your bills between January 1st and August 31st, I'm sorry, you may not. You can't do it because they're not accepting the money during that time. The earliest you could possibly pay your property taxes, because that's what we're talking about here, our annual property taxes, is September 1st. Even if you wanted to be extra good, extra on top of things. Not possible. It's impossible to pay them before September 1st. The bill actually comes out in August, but September 1st is when they're first available to be paid. So, how do we handle the taxes when we have a closing? Well, what we do know is we need to calculate the seller's days versus the buyer's days in the year of closing. What this closing date, whenever that closing date is, that closing date is all about making things fair between the buyer and the seller as of that given date. So, we're going to need to calculate how many days the seller owned it from January 1st, because we know they owned it on that day, at the very least. Even if we close on January 1st, if that's even possible, if there's even an attorney open willing to do it on January 1st, there's at least going to be 1 day to the seller. 1 day the seller's responsible for, because here's another thing to always remember. Seller pays day of closing. Seller pays for it. Always. So, I doubt you'll ever see a closing on January 1st, but if you did, you would have 1 day paid for by the seller, and for our purposes as pre-licensee class, 359 days paid by the buyer. Responsibility of the buyer. That's usually not the case. It's usually more days than that. So what could we have in relation to September 1st? We could have a closing somewhere in this time frame prior to it, or we could have a closing on or after it. If we have a closing on or after September 1st, another issue arises. If we close somewhere on or after September 1st, the next question is, have the taxes been paid yet? Because here's how the taxes work. They're due September 1st. You can't pay them until then. But even though they're due September 1st, you don't have to even pay them then. That's when you could, but you don't have to. When do you think you can pay your taxes? What's the latest possible date without any consequences or penalties that you could pay your property tax? Latest possible date. For our purposes, yeah, December 30th. In real life, December 31st. Yeah, the last day of the year. Last possible day of the year is when you can pay the taxes without any penalties or fees or consequences. So, end of the year. But what if the seller has gone ahead and paid the whole year? What if we close right here on, let's just say, October 17th? It's when we're closing. And the seller went ahead on September 1st. The seller went to the courthouse, went to the government building, stood in line, and there's such a responsible person, so on top of all their bills, they went ahead and paid the whole year. They paid the whole year worth of taxes. But then let's say on September 20th, a few weeks later, they thought, you know what? I think I want to sell this place. Oh no, I already paid my taxes for the year. Is that seller gonna just have to eat it and be out for an entire year of taxes if they went ahead and paid them for the whole year? No, of course not. It's like anything. We'll handle it, right? We'll figure out what portion of the year the seller owes, and we will adjust. Let me change my name here on this. There we go. So we're going to be counting up days. And so in the case of October 17th and the seller has paid the whole year, we're going to need to give that seller back some money. So I've made a mess here. We're closing right here. October 17th. We need to figure out how many days in the year after October 17th there are. Number of days times dollars per day equals the money that we're going to credit to the seller and debit to the buyer in this situation. We're going to give the seller back the buyer's amount of days worth of money. That makes sense? So here's the other part that gets people on this type of question. That day of closing thing, I know you know it. I know you have just learned it and you'll never forget that the seller is responsible for the day of closing. But if you count these days in the wrong direction, you'll probably screw it up at least once. And so my overall advice for every situation is always count seller's days and then handle it after that. So in this very case, we're closing on October 17th. It's very tempting to think, well, there's fewer days on this side of it than on this side of it. So let me just count these. There's just a couple. You know, it's 2 months plus a few days in October. And okay, let's try that. Well, December has 30 days. November has 30 days. And then what about October? October, we're closing on the 17th, but we need to have the days that start on the 18th, right? Because the seller's responsible for the day of closing. So how the heck do we add up the days the buyer's responsible for in the month of closing, the month of October? Well, we could go 30 days minus the 17th. And what is that, 20 or 13? Is that right, though? Is that going to be the buyer's days of the month of closing, 13? In that case, we would have 73 days that the buyer is responsible for paying taxes. Let's see, 13 plus 17, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, I think that's right. It can be real easy, though, to lose track of that day of closing, and it's tricky. So as we go through these different scenarios, and there are 3 of them, let's talk about what those look like. Then we'll actually do some with some numbers involved. So we could have a closing that happens here before September 1st. In that case, the taxes have not been paid yet, have they? not possible. They won't take your money. Government will not take your money before September 1st when it comes to property taxes. Well, that means the seller hasn't paid them. And that means we're going to need to, as of the day of closing, let's say it's July 27th. July 27th is our closing. We need to add up this many days, and who's responsible for those days? Those are the seller days. You got it. Then we're going to add up the rest of them, and those are the buyer's days. But do we even need to know that? We don't. Here's the other thing. When it's a closing before September 1st, it doesn't even matter about how many days are for the buyer, because what we're trying to do all this for is so when we complete the closing disclosure, we know where to put the money and for whom it goes, to whom it goes, and from whom it is removed, debited and credited. So here we go. A July 27th closing. How many days is the seller responsible for if we're closing on July 27th? You could do this several different ways. You can count fingers and toes. You can do hash marks. You could also say, well, in pre-licensing, let's enjoy our privilege of pre-licensing simple days. So that's July is another way to say July is 7/27 because it's the 7th month, right? So that means there are 6 entire months of 30 days each, which means 180 days up to and including the entire month of June. Then we have the 7th month. July 27th is the closing, so we can just tackle on those 27 days. And that means we have 217 days that the seller is responsible for paying taxes. Does that make sense? It's probably about the simplest way to do it. But short of, certainly not simple, but you could count a whole bunch of days. You could say, okay, well, there's January, there's February, there's March, there's April, and that's going to put you to sleep. So I think it's probably just easier to do it this way. Now we know the seller's days. We need to know how much money to take to take from the seller. So that brings us to the next question. What are the annual taxes? And let's say in this case, the annual taxes are $3,600 a year. If the annual taxes are $3,600 a year, what do we need to turn that number into? Not annual or yearly taxes, but we need to turn them into daily taxes, right? Good job. And so we've got our 3,600 and we divide it by our days in the year. And that means every day taxes are accumulating at $10 a day, right? Did I do that wrong? So we've got 217 days to the seller times $10 a day, which means $2,170 of these taxes are the responsibility of the seller. So how do we attribute them? Attribution. How do we attribute the money? Well, the seller hasn't paid them yet. So we're going to have to deduct or debit the seller for $2,170 because that represents these 217 days, including the day of closing for the year. When I finish explaining all of this and the why, I'll turn this into steps, and it's like 4 steps, maybe 3, and it'll clear up. So now that we know how many dollars we're debiting from the seller, what else are we doing with it? Are we going to do anything else with these dollars? Who are we giving them to? Who receives these? If we're taking them from the seller, who are we giving them to? Oh, the 360 is how many days are in a year. For our purposes in this pre-licensing class, we're just going to work with a 360-day year because every month has 30 days for our purposes. Just keeps that just simplifies it a little bit. And the Real Estate Commission lets us do that. So 360 is how many days are in a year. Well, remember, who is this sale between? We have a seller selling to a buyer. And who is going to be the owner when the tax bill comes out on September 1st? The new buyer. So that new buyer needs to be given this $2,170 so that they have it available and they can add that seller's dollars from the days they owned it to their own dollars from the days left in the year of closing that they are the new owner. Add them together and send the whole bill in to the government. That's what we're doing. So we are debiting the seller and crediting the buyer. This is what's called a proration. We're prorating this amount of money. And we do several different kinds of proration in this chapter, but essentially a proration is taking the same amount of money, some certain amount, taking it away from one person and giving it to the other person. That's a true proration. You're prorating it. Instead of the whole $3,600 for the annual taxes, we are chopping it into pieces because the seller only owned it for 217 days, which represents $2,170. And we're going to give that money over, like if we saw two columns, a seller column and a buyer column of all of their expenses and credits, we're going to give that money over to the buyer's side as of the day of closing. And that's why I said earlier that we don't even need to, in this case, when it's a closing before September 1st, we don't even need to know how much the buyer has to pay for the rest of the year, because all we're worried about is making it fair as of this day of closing. That's all that matters for this type of math, for this exercise. So let's do another one. In this case, we'll say taxes are $4,200 a year. The closing is March 23rd. Oh my gosh, threes. Why do threes elude me? Closing is March 23rd, and the taxes for the whole year is $4,200. So, I mean, in the early stages of learning this, I just always go to the visual. We've got our year, our whole year here. Here's our September 1st, just as a reminder. But here's our closing. It's closer to the front end, and it's March 23rd. And so we know we need to add up the seller's days, and then we're going to give them over to the buyer's side. So what are we going to do with the money? We're going to debit the seller and credit the buyer. And then the next question is, after answering what are we going to do with the money, the next question is which money? Whose money are we doing this with? Are we doing it with the seller's money or the buyer's? The seller's days that they're responsible for, which would be these, or the buyer's days, which would be these? Well, we already know because we just did it. We're going to debit the seller for their days, and we're going to give that money to the buyer. So, step one. Let's go ahead and calculate the dollars per day of taxes. And so if we know the taxes are $4,200 a year, how many days are in a year? That's what we're going to divide that by. 4,200 divided by 360. So $11.67 a day. That's how much the taxes are. Now we can do step 2, figure out the days that the seller's responsible for. And then step 3 is just going to be multiplying those 2 steps together. So seller's days are what? Well, the closing is on March 23rd. So that means 2 full months at 30 days each equals 60 days plus March 23rd means another 23 days. So that's 83 days that the seller is responsible for paying taxes. Now we're going to just multiply steps 1 and 2. So we're going to say 83 days times $11.67 a day. Means that the seller's portion that they're responsible for in dollars is $968.61. And so what do we do with it? Oh, we already figured that out in the beginning. We're going to take it from the seller, called debit the seller, and we're going to credit it to the buyer. We're just going to take that $968, and not even we brokers. We have nothing to do with this. The only thing we have to do with this in real life is to check the math on the closing disclosure. We want to make sure that they did it right. Who's they? The closing attorney. That's what we're going to do. As brokers, we're going to make sure they did their math right, but it's the closing attorney. It's actually their paralegal who did all of this work ahead of time before closing, and they don't even have to do it by hand like we're doing. They plug it into a spreadsheet program for closing disclosures, and it automatically calculates it. But if they put it in the wrong field, they could get the wrong answer. So it's still important that someone double checks, because here's the other thing. The Real Estate Commission says we are responsible for verifying everything on the closing disclosure that we are involved with. Catch how I said that. The Real Estate Commission says that we are responsible not for everything on the closing disclosure, just the things that we are involved with. That means what? Brokers are not responsible, basically, for the loan stuff, for checking to make sure the loan information is right. We didn't have anything to do with that part. That was between our buyer, the borrower, and the lender they're working with. Even though it might have been a lender that you connected them with, it's not your job. That's not part of your job. Your responsibility is basically what came over to this closing disclosure from the contract. If it's something that the attorney saw the contract and then put it on the closing disclosure because it shows on the contract that the seller is going to pay money toward the buyer's closing costs or whatever, then yes, that is on us as brokers. So we do need to know how to do this, and we go into more of a deep dive of this in Post-Licensing 302. Okay, that makes sense? Are we good so far? That's number 1. That's probably the easiest one to remember. The other 2 possibilities, if we're closing before September 1st, that's what we just did. But now let's talk about if we close September 1st or after. So let's take the same, let me think here. Yeah, let's just back up a little bit. We'll take the same taxes per year. But this time, instead of closing on March 23rd, let's say we're going to close, we'll call it October 5th. October 5th is when we're closing, and I need to give you one more piece of information. The seller has paid the taxes for the whole year, because we're going to do the third one in a minute after this when the seller has not yet paid the taxes, and that's a whole different strategy. So closing October 5th, seller has paid the taxes for the whole year. That means the seller went ahead and paid the check. So now the seller is owed money. We need to figure out how much money starts the day after closing and runs through the end of the year worth of taxes. We still have our same dollars per day because we didn't change our tax value. Now we need to calculate the buyer's days that they're responsible for. But here's where I encourage you to not do the short version, because I just see it too many times that people lose track of that day of closing. So if we're closing on October 5th, that's 10th month. So that means 9 months at 30 days per month are 270 days plus the 5 in October. So 275 days is what the seller is responsible for. And that's not what we need. We need the buyer's days. So we could do a couple things at this point. We could either go ahead to the next step, calculate how many dollars are the seller's responsibility, and subtract that from the total. Let's do it that way, and then we'll talk about another way. So now let's go our $11.67 times the 275 is how many days the seller's responsible for. 275 times 1167, 3209.25. That's how many dollars the seller has to pay for the year of closing in taxes. But that's not what we need to do and write on the closing disclosure. We need to figure out what to give the seller back. And so step 4 would be take that total for the whole year of $4,200 and subtract the part that the seller's responsible for so that you can see what the buyer's responsible for. 4,200 minus 3209.25. So the buyer's portion is $990.75. And again, since the seller has paid for the whole year, we need to give them back this amount of money. So we're going to credit the seller and this time debit the buyer $990.75. That means the attorney is going down the line on this closing disclosure, and it essentially looks like this. Here's the buyer's side, and here's the seller's side, and here's all the debits or expenses the buyer has to pay, and then here's all the debits or expenses the seller has to pay, and then the credits that they're going to get. And so, like, let's just say the sales price, for instance. The sales price is what to the buyer? Is it a debit or a credit as far as the buyer's concerned? The sale price of the house. Debit or credit to the buyer? Yeah, that's something that buyer's paying, you bet. That's a debit. What is it to the seller? Is it anything to the seller? Sale price. What is it to the seller? The most important thing. It's the reason they're doing this thing, right? It's a big fat credit to the seller. The biggest credit to the seller. Then we've got things like loan amount, the new loan amount that the buyer's borrowing. How is that? What is that to the buyer? Loan amount. This one might get a little confusing because you're thinking, well, on the one hand, they're borrowing the money, so they're going to be paying it back every month for 30 years. But again, as of the day of closing, that's what we need to look at all of these things through the filter of this word, this phrase. What do we need to do with these things as of the day of closing? And as of the day of closing, that loan amount is a credit to the buyer from a third party, from the lender. And so the buyer is going to bring a down payment and they're going to add it to the loan amount, the new loan amount they're borrowing, and they're going to send it over to the seller in the form of the sale price. So don't worry about all the rest of that stuff. The price itself is a debit to the buyer, an expense. The loan amount that they're borrowing for this purchase is a credit to them. They're not getting it in a lump sum to them, the buyer. They're going to have to repay it over time, but that's irrelevant. All we need to worry about is what's happening on day of closing. What about this thing we have already talked about called excise tax? How does that fit into the mix? Is that anything related to the buyer? Is the buyer even worried about excise tax? The buyer's like, I don't care what the excise tax is. I'm not having to pay it. That's a seller debit. Seller pays for that. Although, for your purposes, that is true. The seller pays for it. We're not getting any more complicated than that. But in real life, it's negotiable. And many times, if it's new construction that your buyer is purchasing, the builder has had a custom contract created which says the buyer gets to pay it, not the seller, because they shifted over to them. But for your purposes for this test, excise tax paid by seller. It's in the seller debit column. Are we okay with what we're looking at, this concept of debits and credits in a column kind of a thing? This is just a very simple version of what that closing disclosure is. If you remember, I showed you the loan estimate versus the closing disclosure last week, and that looked really official and fancy. This is just what is going there. The stuff we're making in this handwritten list is what's going to be put on something that looks like that. Let me think. Deed preparation. Preparing the deed for this purchase. Do you remember what we said was the most important document in a transaction? Is it contract or is it the deed? It's the contract, because the attorney looks at the contract to figure out how to write up the deed to accomplish the intended goals. So preparing that deed, I think of it this way. I'll go ahead and tell you, it's a debit to the seller. Seller pays for the preparing of the deed. How much does it cost? Maybe $300 to $500, $300 to $500, something like that. And what they're paying, that seller is paying that attorney to get the deed prepared so that they can sign it over to the buyer. And I think of preparing the deed, because it represents the house, right, as washing your car. Who sells a car without washing it and getting it detailed, right? You think you might get an extra couple of bucks if it looks really good as it can. You clean it up, don't you? So I think of the deed prep as the seller washing their car. They're preparing their car, preparing, in this case, the deed, having an attorney make the deed so that they can sell it. They can transfer the ownership. So that's an expense to the seller. Another one, commission. Real estate commission. Who's paying for that? Think back to our agency talk. That's another seller debit. We're not too far off from all of the rest in the end of the seller debits. There's not a bunch of them. This is just about it. Another one is the seller's loan payoff. We're talking about not the new loan the buyer's getting, but the old loan the seller has been paying down all these years. So who gets to pay off their loan, the seller's loan? Of course, the seller. It's their loan. None of the buyer's business. There's one more that's pretty much it as far as what the seller's expenses are, besides taxes, which is why I pushed them to the end. Due diligence fee. Due diligence fee. And this might take a second to get your head around. Due diligence fee. Did the buyer already give the seller some money when they went under contract called due diligence money? Yeah. So the buyer already gave them that money. They wrote the check out to the seller, and the seller, it's non-refundable. They could have gone ahead and bought a car. They could have paid off some debt. They could have paid off that mortgage. I heard about that last year when all those crazy due diligence monies were flying around. Some people would get in a contract. The seller would take that due diligence money. It's non-refundable, and they paid the mortgage off. And the buyer ended up, for some reason, walking away from the deal, and the seller put their house on the market for a little bit, had a buyer come along, and they ended up with a paid-for property. Just the craziness of the market, but good for them. So the buyer has already given this due diligence money over to the seller, and it's non-refundable. But what we also know is due diligence money is going to be a credit to the buyer's side. However much that due diligence money is, let's say $10,000, it's that much less the buyer needs to bring to closing because it's credited toward their purchase. That's what makes it feel a little better. It doesn't sting quite so much when you have to give the buyer the news. As a broker, you explain to the buyer, look, when you find a house and we want to make an offer, you're going to have to write 2 checks, earnest money and due diligence money, and this one is non-refundable and made out to the seller. What? Are you kidding? No, that's just the way it is. Sorry. But here's the good news. Both of these chunks are credits to you at closing. And so that $10,000 in this case of due diligence money is a credit to the buyer. And so it has to show up as a debit to the seller on the closing statement as well. If it doesn't, then the effect is that the seller gets it twice, and that can't happen. Can't let that happen. So just believe me, just know that due diligence money shows up on the closing disclosure as both a credit to the buyer and a debit to the seller. And then, since we're talking about it, earnest money is different. That's another credit to the buyer, but it's nothing on the seller's side because they never received it at all. So we don't even mess with that. It doesn't show up on the seller's side. And that brings us to property tax. How do we count property tax on the closing disclosure? I need more information. It's going to be one of 3 different potential ways, and it's going to depend on where in the year we close. So the property taxes are going to be handled one of 3 ways, either because we're closing in the first part of the year before September 1st. In that case, if we close before September 1st, it's going to be a debit seller, credit buyer for the seller's portion of taxes, for the seller's portion of tax responsibility for the year. If we close after or on or after September 1st, and the seller has paid for the whole year, it's going to be a credit seller, debit buyer, the buyer's portion of taxes, which is the one we're in the middle of doing right now. I got off on a little detour. We're going to come back to it in a second. And then the other thing that could happen for a closing after September 1st is if the seller has not paid them. Okay, this one's different. This is a little different. Think about it like this. The seller has not paid taxes. They haven't paid them. We're closing here after September 1st. Because since the taxes are payable, they're due and payable. They can be paid. It's available. Then the custom is, let's go ahead and figure out what the seller's responsible for and what the buyer's responsible for, and we will debit the seller their piece and we'll debit the buyer their part. So when it's a situation where we're closing September 1st or after and the seller has not yet paid taxes, it is not a proration. It's not a proration. We're taking from both of them. The attorney, I should say. The attorney is taking the seller's portion, responsibility of taxes, and the buyer's portion and adding them together and sending them to the government, paying that bill in full. And maybe you're saying, well, gosh, we're closing October. Why can't they just give it to the buyer since we have till the end of the year to pay it? Because what are the chances a buyer might, maybe one buyer out of a million, might possibly in their very first year of home ownership forget to do it or intentionally not do it or just think of it as free money and screw up? And I have a feeling maybe that did happen, and that's why they stopped doing it that way, if they've ever done it. I don't know for a fact that they've ever done it in any other way than this, but that's the logic, I think. Okay, let's finish our example here. We were closing October 5th. Closing October 5th, and the seller has paid the taxes. So we had calculated 275 days to the seller times the days per day of taxes, the dollars per day of taxes. So the seller's portion was 3209, and we just subtracted that from the whole total for the year to find out the buyer's portion, and then that's how we knew how much to credit to the seller and debit from the buyer. So over here in this case, what is it? $990.75. It would be I'll just round it to $990. A credit to the seller for $990 and a debit to the buyer for $990. We're taking it from the buyer, giving it to the seller, which basically means out of all of the buyer's debits, which there's a bunch of them, it's just going to be one more in that list. And the buyer will be told, look, you need to bring $43,511 to the closing table if it all adds up to that. And the seller's going to be told, look, you're going to get $111,000 at closing. Those are the big magic numbers that those parties want to know. They ask you, the broker, the buyer says, how much do I have to bring? And they're wanting to know what's the big total they're going to have to bring in order to get this house on day of closing. And this 43 that I pulled from air is because all of their expenses for the closing added up to it. And then what the seller wants to know is, how much am I getting after I pay you and all those other stupid expenses that I shouldn't have to pay? Because some sellers feel that way. So taxes in this case were a debit to buyer, credit to seller, because we were closing after September 1st and they have already been paid. Let's do the last of the three. In this case, I'll still be nice. Let's just say the taxes per day are $12 a day. I won't even make you figure it out. I will next time, but not on this one. Taxes per day are $12. And then we're closing, I don't remember what that last one was, but let's say October 17th. And the seller has not yet paid the taxes. That's our situation. Let me see. Catching up in the chat. Credit the buyer. So who pays it? The attorney. Do you mean how does the money flow when they take it from one and give it to the other? Oh, good. Okay. Yes, right. Well, they take it from the parties they need to and send it in. Yeah. Yep. That'll be what we're going to do right now with this particular example. Closing after September 1st, seller has not paid them for the whole year. They're unpaid. So take a second. Tell me, what's the attorney going to need to do to make this be handled correctly? We're going to need to, step one is figure out the dollars per day. And I gave you that one. we know that dollars per day are 12. Step 2, calculate the seller's days. And so October 17th, that's the 10th month. That means 9 months at 30 days per month is 270 days, plus the 10th month of closing is the closing on the 17th. So 287 days to seller. And we could subtract that from 360 days and then multiply both of those by the dollars per day, or we could just go ahead and do this times $12 per day. 287 times 12 means the seller's responsibility is $34.44. Now that we know this, step 3 is going to be to, here's where my niceness bites me. $12 a day times 360. The total tax bill is $43.20 minus the $34.44. Which means the buyer's days are 876. So the attorney is going to debit the seller for $34.44, and they're going to debit the buyer for $876. And they're going to add those dollars together, and sometime the next day or so from the closing, they're going to send that money in to pay the tax bill for the year. Nobody gets to hold this money when we're closing after September 1st and the seller has not paid them for the year. They go straight in to get paid. So, again, 3 possibilities for taxes. We're closing before September 1st. Then it's going to be a debit the seller and credit the buyer the seller's portion of tax responsibility. If it's a closing after September 1st and the seller has paid, it's going to be a credit the seller and debit the buyer's portion. And then if it's the other thing that could have happened for a closing after September 1st where the seller has not yet paid, then it's not a proration at all. A proration is giving one amount of money to one and taking it from the other. But in this case, we're debiting from both sides their respective amounts. So we're debiting the seller their portion and we're debiting the buyer their portion. We okay with that? Let's see how it, did we do it? Yeah, okay, we did it. There we go. Let's see how, let's pick it back up on the slides and go from there. Okay. We talked about procedures. We had talked about, the whole purpose of this closing is getting that title transferred to the buyer in exchange for the consideration being the purchase price. And also there's a million different funds, little line item expenses to account for too. And so that's the other job of the attorney, is to make sure that all kinds of things get paid. Tell me in the chat, what are some other things that might need to be handled at closing? And for those of you who might have actually had a closing or read ahead or watched HGTV, what sorts of expenses are involved and are paid from a closing. It's not all about the price. What sorts of things are we talking about? Oh, there you go. Yeah, an appraisal needs to be handled. Termite repairs or any other repairs need to be maybe paid for, or at least have an invoice proving it was paid for. A lot of times that's a big thing that the paralegal keeps asking the broker, hey, send me any invoices. Send me the invoice for something I haven't seen pop up in the chat just yet. Home inspections, that's a thing. Attorney fees, you bet. There are a couple of different, for your purposes in pre-licensing, the attorney fees will show up in two ways. The biggest chunk of attorney fees will be a debit to the buyer. And it'll probably show up on the test maybe as little as $500 or $600, but in real life, it's more like $800 to $1,200. It's what the attorney typically charges a buyer for most of that work that they do. The amount of attorney fees that the seller's responsible for your purposes in this class, is pretty much the deed preparation. And it'll be listed that way. Deed prep, $400 or $200 or $300. In real life, it's probably $300 to $500. Deed prep is a seller debit. The rest of the attorney fees are a buyer debit because the attorney is hired by the buyer. They're doing most of their work for the buyer. They are not for the seller. Although there's such a little amount of work the seller needs done that you may as well just let that same attorney handle it. Occasionally, we'll run into a seller that says, I have like a prepaid legal plan, or I've got an attorney, or my son is an attorney, and I'm just going to let them do my part. And if a seller says that to me, what that really means is all there really is for an attorney to do for the seller is to prepare the deed. Okay, fine, whatever. If you want your son to prepare the deed, then he can do it, and then he can just send it over to the actual real closing attorney along with an invoice for his work. And the closing attorney will pay out that attorney for having done the deed prep. And instead of making it themselves, they'll pay another attorney for it. And that's okay. We won't get that complicated in this class for you. Just know that the deed prep will be an item that you'll have to interact with when you're calculating who pays what, buyers versus seller. Seller pays deed prep. There was one more that I just blanked on. There's lots of other ones. We'll talk more about it when we come back from break. I'll see you in 10 minutes. back together. Got about a half a minute. Welcome back. Okay. So yeah, dispersing all of the funds involved in the closing, quite a bit of them. And we learned already that there's a difference between these words, settlement versus closing. Closing is when the deed gets recorded, but we've already handled all the signing before that, right? The settlement happens first. That's when people are signing things. Then we have a closing, which is when the deed is recorded. And ideally, the safest procedure, the safest way to do this thing is to not let the buyer have the keys till the deed gets recorded. Although sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes the seller is cool about it. But as a broker, we want to go on record, make sure they understand the risks. Here's what the buyer's thinking about during that under contract due diligence portion of time. They want to see if any of these items are going to cause them to not want to buy the house. Any of these things and more, but at least these things. And that mostly falls on you to help them, right? Falls on you, the broker, to help them understand, is the street publicly or privately maintained? Are the utilities abnormally high? It's not unusual to hear a request from a buyer agent. Could you send the average utility bills over the last few months, or maybe the summer versus the winter? So my buyer can see, is it some kind of crazy inefficient kind of heating and air system, or maybe insulation is not enough? Just any reason that a buyer would need in order to not proceed needs to be examined and investigated here. It could be that the property has had so many insurance claims against it that it's going to cost a lot more than typical for the insurance policy. That alone could be a reason, especially if a buyer is already very price sensitive, like super sensitive on the down payment, and it's just they're buying at the top of their possible maximum ability, which is a terrible idea, but it happens a lot, especially with new construction. Those builder reps, they don't come across as pushy, most of them usually, but it's just the nature of it. You go in there and you see they usually will have palettes of color samples and types of things, like countertops being granite or versus quartz, and colors, and the kitchen upgrades and the upgrades versus what's included. And it's so difficult for a buyer to resist, because when you turn that into just $1 per month instead of a total price, it's just like it works in cars. That's how they get you on the car lot too. You know, that car's not $40,000. It's $360 a month. It works the same way a lot with new construction. And that's when you, as a broker helping that buyer, want to help them make sure that's what they really want. Help them understand, look, is it more valuable for the real estate purposes of valuation that I use this $3,000 toward a fireplace, or toward the countertop upgrade from the basic kind to the fancy kind, or whatever it is that they're thinking about doing? And then just helping them understand, look, is a floor plan change more important, or the extra bells and whistles? And we're very much involved with new construction. People don't understand that sometimes. They think that new construction, you don't need your own agent. But in new construction, you need one all the more, because it helps you, because that builder, that's who that person represents, that on-site sales rep. They're looking out for that builder, but they're really good at making it feel like they're looking out for you, the buyer. So helping them understand what the expenses are, how much things are going to be. We talked about this right before he left, I believe. Yeah. And that is the wood destroying insect report, WDIR. It includes termites and anything else that can eat wood and compromise the structural integrity. But what does it report? It reports what that inspector can see without touching anything. That inspector does not go invasive. They're not on hands and knees looking in cabinets. They're not pulling out screwdrivers or taking cabinets off walls. They're not even rolling the ladder away from the wall in the garage or the bicycles. They're not touching anything. They're just walking around observing. And if that garage is completely packed, that's a big problem for your buyer, because that inspector's not getting to inspect probably one of the most common places that termites come out of the ground, between the walls and the floor of a garage. That little termite tunnel I think we looked at right before we left the other day. So what does it not report? Things that they can't see. What does it report? What they can see as of that day. Repair negotiations emerge from all of the inspections that your client might choose to have. And, in a market like this, they might not get as much stuff fixed as they would like, because the seller can easily say, well, you want me to fix this and this and this? I'm not fixing anything. Or I'll fix this and this, but not those other 5 things. Because if you walk away, I still keep your due diligence money and I go find another buyer tomorrow because it won't be hard. So that's sort of the attitude right now. In a market that's opposite of this, sellers will be much more accommodating. They'll fix the entire list. Even a neutral market, sometimes depending on the situation and my read of the other side via the listing agent, I'll just advise my buyer to ask for the whole list. Ask for everything, and maybe we'll get the stuff you really care about and give them some easy things to say no to that you don't care about. Just classic negotiating. But whatever those negotiations turn into, they need to be completed within the due diligence period so that you can have it in writing what the seller is officially willing to handle. The repairs don't have to be done during due diligence period, but the negotiations should. That way your buyer can walk away and still get their earnest money if it's a big enough issue for them to want to walk over it. And as a seller's agent, as a listing agent, what are your client's options with repairs? Yeah, I'll fix it. No, I won't fix it. Or I'll fix this, but not that. Somewhere in the middle. All yes, all no, or somewhere in the middle. And that's a big underestimated part of our job. Is helping. That's another second set of negotiating that takes place. We did the price and terms up front. Now we have to do the repairs. Final walkthrough is something you should do before closing to make sure essentially that the property is pretty much the way it was when your buyer fell in love with it, right? No nasty surprises. The seller moved out yesterday, and when they pulled up that carpet in the dining room, it revealed a bunch of termite damage on the wood floor. Or they pulled the couch away from the wall, it revealed big holes in the wall that you couldn't tell, you couldn't see. It wasn't pretty much what you expected. Now, that final walkthrough should not be something that you do an hour before closing. Because some sellers, not a lot of them maybe, but occasionally you run into a cagey seller. And they were supposed to fix the windows. And your inspector put blue tape on all the bad windows. Bad windows probably means they have broken seals. So they're foggy, right? That's a weird item that shows up on inspections. Bad windows go bad. That means the vacuum seal in between the two panes, the dual panes of glass, is compromised, and now it's not serving that R value purpose. It doesn't have any insulation value anymore, and it's a cosmetic issue because it's getting foggier and foggier. And since the windows were probably put in at the same time, if one has a broken seal and gets foggy, it's probably not long before some other ones do as well. Well, I've run into that many times where the seller says, "Oh, you meant that window on the right. I thought you meant the one on the left. I didn't order that one. Sorry. And so if it's an hour before closing, you're not getting a new window before closing. Best practice that I've found, this is just street advice. As soon as you get word that these repairs have been done, even if your client can't go with you, you go do the walkthrough. Hopefully days or even a week before closing. So if the seller tries that nonsense, you can say, oh, no harm, no foul, no big deal. Glad you have a whole week to make it right. Right? None of this, to 45 minutes from closing. What if that did happen and your walkthrough is 45 minutes from closing day, closing time, and there's stuff not fixed? What are your buyer's options if the things haven't been fixed and there's no time for them to be fixed before closing? What choices does your buyer have? Think about the situation. Your buyer has been working hard satisfying the lender this whole time. The lender has asked for all kinds of documents. Your buyer has given them to them probably several times, the same document. They're just over it. Finally, the lender said, okay, I'm going to give you the money. Finally got loan approval. The buyer went ahead and hired movers. The movers went ahead and loaded up the truck this morning or yesterday. The buyers slept on the floor or in a motel last night with the kids and the dog, the illegal dog that they snuck in. And now they're trying to get it all closed today so they can have a new place to live in. And now you're finding out that there's a significant item still left undone. Your buyer is real tempted just to suck it up, show up, sign the papers, get those keys. The keys are pretty important. Maybe more important to your buyer than the principle of the thing. How much money is that left undone item worth? Depends on, how bad does that buyer want the house? How bad do they need it? What's going to happen if they do postpone closing? Well, they're going to have to empty the moving truck probably into a mini storage for a couple of days until the closing does happen. That means 2 moves instead of 1 that they get to pay for. Yes, they could try to demand the seller pay for it, but good luck with that. Maybe, maybe not. It gets messy, is my point. So it's really good to do that final walkthrough to verify repairs have been done before the time can work against your buyer client, just in case. But officially, that final walkthrough is going to happen pretty close, day before, evening before, morning of closing. But again, make sure those repairs were done before that moment in time. And then obviously, once due diligence period is over, now the earnest money is in play. It is subject to be lost if the buyer does choose to walk. What's the seller concerned with during this period of time? The buyer is concerned with all of that big double list we saw. Seller's worried about, will the buyer have the money? If it's cash deal, do they already have it? Hopefully they got a proof of funds letter from their bank showing you that they really do have it, which is kind of a joke because that doesn't mean they couldn't spend it, right? But just have to gauge their seriousness. Also, if it's a loan, did that loan get approved? And were all of the various moving parts, contract terms completed? Did all those terms get met? That's what the seller's concerned about. That's what you as the listing agent are helping them verify. Here's our document preparation or deed prep. The attorney's doing this little bit of work for the seller. Buyer's attorney is doing this for the seller unless the seller wants their attorney to do it. So some other stuff that's happening is any sort of mortgage payoff that the seller owes for existing loans, personal property. Maybe the parties are selling some stuff besides the house. Maybe the buyer says, I want the patio furniture, the pool equipment, the big desk upstairs, and the sectional couch. Can we throw that in? The seller says, yeah, if you give me another X dollars, then yeah, we'll include it. Well, if you try to write that into the contract under the personal property section, the first question to ask is the lender going to care about this? And the answer is probably yes. The lender doesn't want to see all that in there. They're going to ask, are you financing with us in order to buy a house, or are you financing with us to buy a desk and some pool furniture with a house wrapped around it? And how much value of the house is toward all that personal property? We don't want to see it in the contract. Get it out of there. We don't want it in there. Well, if the lender demands that the extra stuff is not in the contract, how do we make sure that it gets left by the seller? And that would be in the form of a bill of sale. A personal property bill of sale is something the attorney can help with. They'll either write one up custom, or they might even have a generic one that you can, as the broker, fill in the blanks. Write that desk and that couch in, and now you have something in writing signed by both parties acknowledging that for $1, one person's going to give the other person these things, when it's really because they added, $1,000 more on the purchase price, perhaps. And then the other thing is the attorney is going to verify this last item, that there have been no unpaid bills in the last 120 days. What does that sound like? That 120-day time frame, what's that remind you of for as far as lien priority? Back when we studied specific liens, which type of specific lien had something to do with 120 days? There you go. A mechanic's lien can be filed within 120 days of the last day the work or materials was provided. So that attorney wants to make sure no mechanic's liens are out there. They're going to ask the seller, have you had any work done that you didn't pay for that could show up in the form of a mechanic's lien and mess this whole thing up? That's why that question's there. That's something they're going to ask the seller. For the buyer, the attorney is going to, of course, handle all those loan documents. That lender, the big question for the buyer side is, do we have the loan package? Hey, attorney, have you received the loan package from the lender? And it's going to be 2 inches thick worth of papers of all sorts of things, tax documents and lender-related things, and the deed of trust and the promissory note, and how many aliases have you ever had, and all of the things. So whatever those loan documents are that the lender requires get signed is going to be what the attorney is going to be showing. And you're sitting around a table, and the attorney's holding a document out on the table in front of that buyer and says, this is what this one's about. Sign here, initial here, and put the date. Oh, no, don't put your middle initial, just your whatever, right? Loan documents, title insurance. The attorney's going to talk to them about how they did the title search and they didn't find anything troubling. And so the title insurance policy, here it is, sign it between you and the title insurance company. Property insurance, that's another one that gets handled. Something you as the buyer broker has done before closing is told your buyer, look, you're going to need to shop for insurance. Good place to start is your auto insurance. They might give you a deal, a package deal. Since you have your car with them, they might also give you a break on the house stuff. So start there, maybe shop around, and once you pick, well before closing, have that insurance agent send something called an insurance binder, basically a document that says, here's what we're going to do. Here's how much the coverage I advise and we're going to do. Send that over to the attorney. Now the attorney knows how much to take from the buyer or charge the buyer so that they can send that into the insurance company. Because there's 2 line items that are going to show up on the closing disclosure regarding insurance. The 1-year premium, that's just always going to be, especially for pre-licensing. You're going to see first year's insurance premium, $730, $910, $1,000, whatever. Pay for the first year at closing. But then guess what? They want coverage for those years after closing too, so we need to set them up for that. So it's going to be the first year's premium in full, as well as a couple of months worth of prorated monthly insurance. How much is the insurance per month? $27. Well, the lender wants you to collect, you, the closing attorney, the lender asks the closing attorney, please collect 3 months worth, or 4 months, or 6 months, or 1 month of insurance so that we can set up the escrow account. Because that lender is going to charge the buyer 1/12 of the annual premium every month. That's going to be part of their PITI payment. That's what the I is in PITI, the second I. They're going to want to set up the escrow accounts so they have enough cushion, padding, and the money is available when the bill comes due. You don't pay that insurance bill to the insurance company every month necessarily, unless you set it up that way. It could be once a year or maybe twice a year or quarterly. Whatever it is, the lender needs to have it available to pay with. And they want to have cushion. They don't want to have to year after year, every year, call that buyer and say, oh, we need you to put a couple more bucks into the account so we have enough. They want to have a cushion. And that's called setting up the escrows. WDIR, that's the termite letter. Survey, that'd be another thing that we advise the buyer get at time of purchase. And that's something the attorney's going to show to them and say, do you have any questions about the survey? By the way, if they have questions about the survey, do we as the broker answer those questions? If they have survey questions, that would be called interpreting the survey, and it's sort of like giving legal advice. So surveyors or attorneys need to answer their survey questions, not you. It's tempting, though. It's just a drawing on a piece of paper, and it's tempting to draw out what you think might represent 10 or 20 feet on a little slip of paper and kind of start drawing shapes on the survey and figure out how they should lay out their fence or what things mean on that survey. But we should resist the urge. Title insurance, we talked about it once upon a time. Once the attorney does the title search, they're going to tell the insurance company, look, it's safe. Everything checks out. I don't see any problems. You're safe to give coverage, and it's a one and done situation. Title insurance is not monthly. It's one amount paid at closing, but there's two kinds of coverage. The buyer themselves or borrower themselves need coverage. They need a policy that covers the entire value of the property because that's what they care about, the entire property. But then there's a second policy that needs to be written, and that just protects the lender. And the lender's policy is only the part that the lender cares about, which is, you guessed it, the loan amount. So there's two title insurance policies. The buyer pays for them both. The lender requires that. The lender wants coverage, and the buyer should have their own coverage too. Eventually, that lender policy will go away. When will the lender policy go away? Lender policy will go away when there's no more loan. You got it. You got it. When that loan is paid in full, there's no need for a lender to have coverage because there's no more lender. Some title procedures. We talked about the title search by the attorney, and they're checking the chain of title for one thing. Title, that goes back to the deed. That's basically the deed. And the attorney checks this index called the Grantor Grantee Index. It's something they subscribe to, sort of like how brokers subscribe to the MLS. Attorneys subscribe to this service, and it shows every property's owners back up to at least 30 years, right? So for 30 years, that attorney looks back and says, this current seller bought it from that seller before them, and then that seller before them, and them, and them, and them, and them. And the attorney just needs to go back and look at that chain of title for 30 years, and that satisfies the thing that's called the Marketable Title Securities Act. That's enough. You don't need to worry about 31, 40, 50, 100 years back, because anything that got weird back then is not going to affect the title. Those clouds, if there are any older than 30 years back, are extinguished, irrelevant. So the attorney only has to go back 30 years. And if you remember, I believe on the midterm, there was a question about that. What is it that requires the attorney go back 30 years? And it's the Marketable Title Act, right? Once they've done the investigation, they're going to give an opinion. Say, it all looked good to me. And they're telling this opinion, giving this opinion to the title insurance company, who will then issue the policy. Closing is conducted, or settlement is conducted. Who chooses where and when the settlement happens? Who chooses that? The one who pays for it. And who's paying the bulk of the closing expenses? The attorney, I should say, the attorney expenses. Let me change this back to public. The one who picks the attorney is the one who pays most of the attorney fees, and that person is the buyer. The buyer pays the bulk of the attorney fees, so it's the buyer who proposes the date and time of the closing typically. Now, that is a negotiable thing. The seller might say, well, I can't do it that soon, or I got to do it later. But it's the buyer who comes up with the idea. We don't do this thing called escrow. If you ever watched HGTV and they mention, hey, well, let's celebrate. We had close of escrow. You ever heard that phrase, or coming from another state, close of escrow? That's not how we do it here. Closing escrow involves an uninterested, or I guess an impartial third party. But here in North Carolina, somebody represents somebody. Always. There's always representation happening, even with the attorney. And so we don't do this escrow method with an impartial attorney. We do a settlement meeting where the attorney officially represents the buyer. But they do a couple things for the seller because there's not much left to do. But officially, that seller would not want to ask advice from that attorney if there was a dispute between them and their buyer, because the attorney is representing the buyer and the lender. Does it have to be an actual attorney who tells everybody where to sign the documents and explains the documents? In other words, conducting the settlement. Let me paint a picture. Settlement in person looks like this. The buyer and seller show up, maybe not at the same time, maybe not even on the same day. The seller could sign the papers that they need to sign early. But regardless, if they do show up on the same day, same time, they don't sit around the table together anymore. They used to. You'd have buyers on one side with their agent, seller on the other side of the table with their agent, and the attorney at the head of the table. But that kind of went away in these last few years. Certainly with COVID, but even before then, it was kind of starting to go away. Now the attorney will usually bring the seller side back first, because the seller's only going to take 15 or 20 minutes. There's only like 5 things they need to sign, and they don't usually have that many questions either. So they'll go back and they'll sign the deed, because they're the only ones that sign the deed, grantor only. The closing disclosure, their own side of the closing disclosure, and a couple other things, like a tax document so the attorney can tell the IRS that they sold a property. Yes, that's a thing. Then once the seller's done, they're going to bring the buyer's side and agents back there and sign the buyer's stuff, and that's going to take longer. Then once it's all signed, nobody's getting money yet, because we still have to, the attorney, take all those things everybody signed and scan them and send them to the lender for somebody at the lenders to look over and make sure they didn't miss a signature or an initial. Once they verified all that's good, they'll make sure the loan is funded, meaning the loan amount gets wired to the attorney's account. Now the attorney has the money available to pay out all these various things that need to be paid. Between the money they got from the buyer in the form of a down payment and the money they get from the lender in the form of the loan amount, now they have the entire consideration, right? All of the purchase price. And now they can pay for the warranty. They can pay the warranty company for that, and the inspectors maybe if they haven't been paid yet, and everything, taxes, whatever. Then finally, once all those things are verified, they tell the attorney, you are good to go. You may go and record the deed. But the attorney's not going to record the deed right away. What's the attorney going to do before they record the deed? That one last thing. It's one thing they're going to check one more time real quick before they record that deed. You got it. One more title search. One more check. They did one, but that was a week or two ago. And in the meantime, the roofer could have filed a mechanics lien. So let's make sure no other vendors, no mechanics liens or any other kind of lien. It could be an IRS lien. It could be any kind of lien. They got thrown in there the last second. So the attorney wants to make sure that's covered. Then they'll record the deed. Then the paralegal will send you an email or make you give you a call and say, good news, we are on record. It has recorded. And you're going to think, oh, thank goodness, I can get my check. And you're going to go to the attorney's office and get a check, but that's not the one that has your name on it. That check has your firm's name on it. And you're going to be like, oh, still not my check. And you're going to speed your way across town to your office, turn the check in to your office along with whatever documents you still need to give them. Then, hopefully the same day, but that's up to you and your firm. It's up to your firm, not even you. They'll eventually give you your check. You're the last one to get paid. Congratulations. Hopefully you haven't spent it. That's tempting. But all that said, who's the one that's telling the parties where to sign? It doesn't have to be an attorney. It could even be you. A broker could conduct a settlement meeting. It's not a great idea. I don't want to do it. But it could be a non-attorney. There are people who just travel around being a settlement agent, and they are not an attorney. But they better have an attorney on speed dial. There was an attorney who did all the paperwork, but it doesn't have to be an official attorney who says sign here and initial there. You could meet at an attorney's office like traditionally, or I've had closings conducted by non-attorney settlement agents at a Chinese restaurant. Had one done there. That was delicious. Had one done in the new house that my seller had bought before she closed on the one I helped her sell. And we sat in her new kitchen table with boxes all over the place and signed those documents with that person. And guess what? One of the parties had a question, a legal question, while we sat in her kitchen. And that non-attorney could not answer the legal question because they're not an attorney. And so they had to make a phone call, inevitably. Anytime it's a non-attorney holding the settlement, somebody has a question that they can't answer. So they need to be able to call an attorney and get the answer. So that's just part of the process, but it's allowable. An attorney does not have to conduct the settlement meeting. And the buyer and seller don't have to be there together. And especially these last couple of years, we saw how unnecessary that really is. And frequently it's hard to coordinate schedules. So I'll tell sellers, look, you could come in maybe the day before or the couple days, as long as the attorney has your documents ready for you to sign them. You're not going to get your proceeds on Wednesday if the closing's actually Friday, but you're coming in Wednesday to sign your part, but your signing will be out of the way. We can get that done. And then once the buyer does their part on Friday, then you can come get your check if all goes well. Here's the big one. While the parties don't have to be in the same room, you, the broker, need to go to closing. You want it to be nice and boring. You don't want exciting closings. And there's not a whole lot typically that we do there. We just sit there. The attorney is running the show there, or the settlement agent in that case. But the real estate commission says, don't you get lazy. Don't you just stay on the couch and say, hey, did the closing go well? Can you send me my check? No. The real estate commission says we have violated our fiduciary duties to our clients if we do not attend the settlement meeting. And there are plenty of agents who screw this up because they get lazy. They call it being busy, but it's like you're missing your priority. You're misplacing your priorities. I mean, that's a great opportunity. For one thing, besides it being a fiduciary responsibility, that should be a happy day. While boring, you should make it a big deal, right? Celebrate. Have them have pictures with like a sold sign or whatever you can use for your marketing. Turn it into a thing, an event. Give them the gift. Whether you do it in front of the other party in the room or privately at the car, or you follow them to the house afterward. They might rope you into helping them move, but you got to show up. The commission says so. And so that closing is resolving two things. They're saying, hey, did all the promises get fulfilled? And has the buyer's loan been signed off? Is it all finalized? The another piece of legislation you need to be familiar with, just basically know that the Good Fund Settlement Act says the deed must be recorded before the funds can be dispersed. Before the seller gets their proceeds check, before you, the broker, gets your money, got to record that deed, because that involves checking for liens one more time. So that's not done until that. Good Fund Settlement Act, record the deed and the deed of trust prior to dispersing any funds. That attorney can't disperse funds until these things have been recorded. And that's it. We've talked about this already. The title is updated and recorded. The deed of trust gets recorded too. What is it that says the title and deed of trust? The title meaning the deed itself. So the deed and the deed of trust has to be recorded. What says so? Why? Why does the deed and deed of trust have to be recorded? What is it that dictates that requires that? It's easy to mix it up with another one. One of them says that something must be in writing to be enforceable. The other thing says something must be recorded to protect against third-party claims. There you go. You got it. The statute of frauds says must be in writing to be enforceable. The Connor Act is what I was looking for. It says it must be recorded to protect against somebody else coming along and saying they have some ownership interest in it. And that is what it requires, the deed to be recorded and the deed of trust to be recorded. And by the way, don't forget, married seller couple, buyer couple, married buyer couple, even if one of them has lousy credit and they're not going to be on the loan itself, only that person with the better credit gets to sign the promissory note, but both of them have to sign the deed of trust. Even the one with bad credit that's not going to be on the loan, because they both have to acknowledge that, yeah, if we don't pay, we don't stay. You can take it from us through foreclosure, and they sign that deed of trust pledging the property as collateral, both of them. So do both buyers have to show up? Sometimes we get that question, and they say, well, he's the only one on the loan. Do I even need to be there? Yes, you do. You got to sign the deed of trust, even though you're not on the loan. And once those liens are verified that there's no additional ones, anything that is on there gets paid and closed or canceled, then the closing happens, then the funds can be given away, handed out, paid out, and the sale gets reported to the IRS to be handled at tax time. So the main document, there's the deed of trust, but both parties, the buyer and the seller both, get some version of a closing disclosure. They don't see each other's closing disclosure. We used to do it that way. You'd go to a closing and there was no CD. Years ago, it used to just be a HUD-1 form. And on that HUD-1 form, the buyer's column was right there and the seller's column was right there, and the seller knew the buyer's new interest rate and loan amount and down payment. The buyer saw what the seller's loan payoff was and what that seller was going to get in proceeds at closing, and it was just a little gross. It's like, none of your business. Why do we do it this way? But as of the CD, closing disclosure development in this procedure, they separated it as part of the whole consequences of the 2008 Dodd-Frank Act and all that stuff. Now the buyer has their own version that only they see, and the seller has their own version of this closing disclosure that only they see. We still do occasionally see that HUD-1 form when it's a cash deal. So a cash deal will use the old kind of of line item document called a HUD-1. Don't forget, a closing disclosure is a part of a requirement when you're borrowing money. Think of it that way. Is this a transaction where they're paying all cash, or is this a transaction where they're borrowing money? Most of them are going to be financed. So most of them are going to require closing disclosures, but not every one. So you'll be in the business sometime and you'll ask the attorney, hey, did you send me the closing disclosure yet? And they'll say, well, there is none. Wait, what? Because it's not financed, it's cash. I'll send you the HUD-1, but it's essentially the same kind of a concept. A document that shows all of the expenses and credits, all the debits and credits. What do you think happens if we don't account for every dollar and cent on the closing disclosure? What is that called if you're hiding money from the lender? Yeah, how'd that make you feel, Joseph, seeing what that builder made? Joseph said in the chat he saw when he bought a new home that he saw how much profit the builder made. Hopefully that builder did what they were supposed to do for you, and you're like, okay, you deserved it. But sometimes they let you down, and you're like, it's just insult to injury. What was my question? I just forgot. I don't remember. Give me any random answer because I won't know the difference. I'll think of it later. I totally blanked. I appreciate that. Amnesia is contagious. Let's see. Accounting for all the funds in the transaction. Then that closing attorney or settlement agent, same person, disperses all the funds from their trust account. They've got an account where they're holding all this various money. The down payment from the buyer, the loan amount from the buyer's lender, and then they're going to write checks out of that trust account to all of the various places the money needs to go. Oh, that's what the question was. I knew I'd think of it. If you don't account for all the money on the closing disclosure, that could be, thank you, loan fraud. That's what you're trying to avoid, loan fraud. Do you remember what the maximum prison term is for loan fraud? Loan fraud, federal crime, federal offense, felony. Maximum sentence for loan fraud, 30 years, just like a mortgage. Speaking of sentences. And then the maximum penalty in terms of money, $1 million. So the lender you want to make sure that lender knows all the money, especially gift money coming from mom and dad, coming from someplace. Do they really expect to be paid back, or is it truly a gift? Because that person, you might think, well, that's silly. Why is it a big deal? If that buyer-borrower receiving the gift prioritizes paying back the person who gave them the gift more than paying their mortgage, now the lender is in a foreclosure situation, right? They might have to foreclose. Did the buyer-borrower pay back the gift giver because it wasn't really a gift, it was a loan? That's why the lender cares. Is it something that could cause them to not pay us our money, not pay us our interest, and therefore trigger foreclosure? So it's very tempting to solve problems, to solve issues. And somebody, I promise you, as a broker, it might be the other broker on the other side of the transaction. It might be a buyer or a seller, and they'll say, well, the seller's going to pay for those windows to be replaced, but I don't want to put it on the contract. I don't want to put it on the closing disclosure. Can we just leave it off of there? Can the seller just give me a check for $2,000 out in the lobby of the closing attorney's office, and let's not even pretend it happened? Okay, how much is your license worth to you? How much is your freedom worth to you, right? So don't do loan fraud, and don't be a party to it, because everybody gets thrown under buses when everybody gets caught. RESPA is a big deal because it stands for the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. It's the law that says here's how you should do settlements. Here's how real estate settlements should be handled. RESPA was first enacted in 74, and it's there to basically protect consumers against lenders. And there's a little bit of responsibility on us as brokers, but most of the responsibilities and protections under RESPA are for the consumer in a lending, borrowing situation. RESPA is mostly there to keep lenders in check. But as you'll see in the bullet point 3, RESPA also has a provision that says, hey, brokers, don't you be getting paid by that loan, by anybody. Don't you be getting paid by the inspector because you sent them this warm body buyer client and told them to use that particular inspector. You told him that not because the inspector does good work, but because you knew that inspector would pay you $100 under the table. That'd be a kickback, and it's not allowed. Inspectors, repair people, warranty companies. Well, there's a little asterisk about warranty companies I'll talk to you about in a minute. But for the most part, any vendor associated with a closing cannot pay you as a broker for the lead if you refer your client to them, right? Inspectors, appraisers, surveyors, attorneys, closing attorneys, lenders, the actual lender, loan officer themselves, no kickbacks being paid to brokers for you having referred your buyer client to them. Not allowed under RESPA. RESPA also, second bullet point, requires that we give the lender gives accurate estimates to the borrower and says, here's how much it's going to cost for this loan. And we touched on that last week. I showed you the 3 categories. We'll be talking about those again when we come back from break. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll see you back in 10. Welcome back. Okay. Where were we? We're talking about RESPA. RESPA protects consumers against lenders. It also makes sure brokers don't get kickbacks from other closing related partners. It also requires that accurate estimates are given on the settlement charges. We talked about two things. We talked about the loan estimate document. When does the loan estimate have to be given to the borrower? What's the deadline for this document called the loan estimate? When is it required that it's given to that borrower? It's within how many days of what event? It's hard when it's not multiple choice. 3, 5, or 7 days. 3 days, 5 days, 7 days. There's a lot of 3 days in this business, in this class. And this is another one. Within 3 days of what must that loan estimate be given to the borrower? 3 days of what thing happening? Remember, this is in the beginning of the process, right? Somewhere around the time you go under contract. And that's the start of the loan approval process, which is triggered with the loan application. Loan application, right? 3 days from loan application is when the loan estimate is due to be given to the borrower. But what is it that makes something the date of loan application? Does it mean you're giving them permission to check your credit and you're signing stuff saying you work at this place and here's your pay stubs? Yes, in part. But there's a very specific piece of information that you acknowledge and you give that lender that makes it the loan application date, requiring this loan estimate be given within 3 days of this event happening. What are you telling that lender that you're going to buy? Loan estimate must be given to the borrower within 3 days of loan application being made. And loan application is considered the date when you gave them the address of the property. That's the loan application date. And now that lender has 3 days to give the borrower the loan estimate, showing pretty darn close to what they're going to need to be, what they're going to expect to have to spend. Pretty close to here's what your expenses are going to be for this loan. Another thing RESPA requires is that the lender doesn't take advantage of the borrower and charge them a whole bunch of extra money and say, look, we need to collect money for escrow and therefore give us $14 million so that we can invest it in our own in investments of choice and make all of that interest. No, they can't treat it like a profit center. The lender has to collect only a certain amount, a certain minimum amount to set up the escrow account. And so just as a recap, here's what that looks like. What that borrower is going to have is a PITI payment, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And we know this is the part going to the lender. One part of it is paying the loan down. Another part is the interest. But then this is the part every month that gets put over into an escrow account that the lender sets up on your behalf if you're the borrower. And they're going to collect 1/12 of the year, because it's 1 month's worth, right? 1/12 of the year for taxes and 1/12 for insurance with every payment. They're going to stick it in this escrow account every month, another 12th, another 12th. But in order to start up this escrow account at closing, the lender gives instructions to the closing attorney as follows. They'll say, and it depends, whatever the lender wants. And it also partly depends on the time of year the closing is happening. So they'll say, for instance, we want you, hey, attorney, we want you to go ahead and collect 3 months of insurance from the borrower and 5 months of taxes. And we're going to use that chunk of money to set up this escrow account. And then every month with every payment, we're going to add to it from the PITI payment, the TI of the PITI payment. And it's going to accumulate. That escrow account's going to maybe start right about here, and it's just going to keep going up every month with every payment. It started down here setting up the escrow with this chunk of however many months that the lender required of each. And then it grew. And then when those tax bill comes out, sometime in September is when it comes out, September 1st. But really, what I've noticed is lenders wait until like November, December to pay the tax bill. But the money's there. And they'll use most of it to pay that tax bill. And then they'll knock it back down to, just a little bit of the cushion amount. And then it'll build back up for the next year. And the same thing for insurance. So that's kind of the dynamics there. That's what's happening. And that's what we mean when we say collect it for escrow. The attorney wants to collect so much money for taxes and insurance to set up the escrow account. That's what we mean. Something else under RESPA, the thing that says what it pertains to. Regulation X says that the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act pertains to certain properties. it covers most residential. It's pretty much up to 4 units, single family, condos, townhomes, and multifamily, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. Typically, a 5-plex or more, like 5 units or more, is considered commercial. So RESPA, Closing Procedures Act, deals in mostly residential, up to 4 units, single family, condos, townhomes, and then what kind of loan types. The thing there at the bottom says loans that are financed with federally related money, federally related new loans. And I know your first thought is, oh, that means RESPA only applies to FHA or VA. But that's not what it's talking about. It does include those, but it also includes conventional loans too. How can a conventional loan be considered federally related? Well, as a result of the nonsense misbehavior back in 2008, years leading up to it, one of the ways that the government put into place to keep that from happening again, the rampant loan fraud and all the misbehavior and the financial crisis, was something called the Dodd-Frank Act. And part of that said, look, the government's now going to have some oversight. The government's going to make sure the lenders are doing it right and not rampantly abusing things. So officially, because there's government oversight across the entire loan lending industry, all loans are federally related in that way. Because basically, does government oversee it? Yes, even conventional loans. Therefore, conventional FHA, VA, pretty much any loan type has to comply with RESPA guidelines. These things. So this is who it's for, these types of properties, including all kinds of loan types. Here's our loan estimate we talked about, due within 3 days of the loan application date. Loan application date being the date when the address is told to the lender. And it's the LE that has to be given, the loan estimate has to be given, and a document called Your Home Loan Toolkit, basically a PDF disclosure. And it says, hey, borrower, it basically says, if you don't pay, you don't stay. Here's what foreclosure looks like. Don't let that happen to you. Make your mortgage payment. Be responsible. And that's required to be given to the borrower by the lender as well. That involves disclosing the various expenses. The lender's telling the buyer, look, here's what you're going to be dealing with. Here's what we're going to expect of you. Here's what your expenses are going to be. And there are the 2 deadlines. We talked about the loan estimate deadline. There's another one on the other end of the transaction. Don't forget, it goes all the way from loan application at the start of the under contract phase to the closing. And so we've got a document the lender has to give to the borrower called the loan estimate. Got to give it to the borrower within 3 days of applying for the loan. And that loan estimate needs to look really similar to the other document that we already been talking about called a closing disclosure. And that closing disclosure must be given to the borrower no sooner than 3 days before closing. Fast forward all the way to closing day. That lender has to give that borrower the closing disclosure at least 3 days before the closing happens. And if certain things get changed, if the lender changes things on the closing disclosure, certain things, not just any old thing, they're going to have to start over. Like, let's say they give them a closing disclosure on Wednesday and we're going to close on Friday. Let's say Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Let's say they give it to them on Tuesday. Let's say on Thursday, though, for some reason, the interest rate changes from 6.5 to 6 3/4. Now they have to issue a new closing disclosure. And now we're not closing tomorrow on Friday. The soonest we could possibly close, since the new closing disclosure has been issued, is now going to be Friday, Monday, Tuesday. So like 3 days from now, not tomorrow anymore, because the lender changed some terms. Some terms got changed. And if it's payment or interest rate related, it triggers a new 3 days before of time. So the borrower can look it all over and make sure that they're okay with it. And there's no way around that 3 days. This all falls under something called TILA-RESPA. There's an acronym for TILA-RESPA. And it's an acronym of an acronym. So TILA stands for Truth in Lending Act. Truth in Lending Act says the money must be accurate. You got to tell the truth, lender. Got to tell that borrower the truth. And then RESPA, we know that stands for Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. Well, there's another thing. This acronym you might have heard of called TRID stands for TILA, RESPA, Information Disclosure. TILA RESPA Information Disclosure is TRID, which says that the lender has to provide and disclose these loan estimates, these expenses within a certain time frame. I think I mentioned last week these different tolerances, and I showed them to you on the closing disclosure where they get put. And one of them is something, if the lender promises it on the loan estimate, it cannot be any higher when we get to closing on the closing disclosure, because the lender has full control over what those fees are. Fees like an origination fee or a flood certification or discount points. Those fees are in the full power of the lender. Therefore, they better give the borrower exactly what it's going to be on the loan estimate, and it better be the same on the closing disclosure. And if it's not, if it's higher, the lender has to pay for it. The borrower doesn't have to. So you better believe that lender is real good at that. In fact, they probably inflate it a little bit on the loan estimate so that on the closing disclosure, they can say, oh, it was $1,000 less than we told you. Look how much money we saved you. We see that happen a lot. Maybe not as much as 1,000, but it's going to be probably higher on the LE than it is on the CD. There's another category, and this is not in the full control of the lender. In this 10% category, the lender has said to the borrower, look, here's a list of like appraisers or credit reporting agencies or some list of vendors that you can pick from. You got to pick one of these 3 or one of these 5. So the lender has some say in who they pick or the list from whom they pick. And therefore, if they're off by more than 10% higher on the closing disclosure than what it was promised to be, the lender, again, has to pay for it. And then finally, the no limit category is when the borrower doesn't rely on the lender for the thing at all. Typically a home inspection. Inspection stuff, survey, those are things the lender doesn't give the buyer any sort of feedback on or suggestions for. It's up to the buyer who they want to hire and how many inspections and how detailed they want to get. In fact, if they wanted to have a water test because it's on a well, a water test could be $100 or it could be $1,200. Depends on what they're testing for. And if it's near Duke Energy, coal, ash deposits, they might want the $1,200 version because that tests for heavy metals, right? Tests for radioactivity stuff, tests for cancer-causing things. But just plain old basic water test is checking for like coliform bacteria, mouse poop, or dead mice, or just something gross but not that big a deal. Easily treatable with a bunch of chlorine, right? It smells like chlorine for a week, but the well now is treated. So that's up to the borrower. And so therefore the lender doesn't have any responsibility on paying for any sort of overage there. There's some other things that RESPA is in charge of, and they verify controlled business arrangements. If some real estate firms also have an in-house mortgage company, for instance. There's actually a lender right now who promotes, and it's fine, it's actually legal. He promotes agents and says to agents, look, agent, if you will go ahead and take the mortgage broker test, take the class, take the test. It costs a couple $100, I think. Takes several hours sitting through the course. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? If you thought this was dry, I can only imagine what that one's like. And once you do and become a mortgage broker officially, you don't ever really have to do the loan, but because you have the mortgage broker's license, now he can pay you a referral fee, just like in real estate. If you want to pay a real estate referral fee or get paid a referral fee, you have to have a real estate license. Same idea. Well, if you do that with that lender, and now you're kind of officially a mortgage broker, even though you may not actually be doing the loan, you would have to disclose to your buyer, look, just letting you know, I'm also a mortgage broker. You can run it through me in my arrangement with this particular lender, and I'll get paid a referral for the loan. And so I have to tell you that. That's what a controlled business arrangement disclosure means. Telling them where you're making your money. Maybe not just from the brokerage, but also from the in-house mortgage company or any other kind of an in-house kind of arrangement. Borrower credit for yield spread premiums. They don't dig too deep into that. It's basically giving back borrowers some money to make sure that the escrow stuff is not charged too much. There's also escrow account restrictions. They can only collect a certain minimum number of months or maximum, number of months for setting up the escrow accounts and disclosing who's going to service the loan. RESPA says that the lender has to tell you if they're going to keep the loan or sell it to another lender. And by the way, if it's a conventional loan, what are the odds that they're going to sell it to another lender, high or low? Is it likely or unlikely that they're going to sell it to another lender if it's a conventional loan where you have good credit and it's A paper and everybody likes it? Everybody kind of wants your promissory note anyway. You bet. Greater likelihood a conventional loan gets sold. We talked about it, I think, last week. Some people, for whatever reason, don't want to, whoever they sign up with for that loan, they don't want that to change. And, I've found that a credit union, quite often, especially the state employees credit union, they won't sell their loan. They service their own loan. So whoever it is that's going to service the loan that you'll be making the loan payment to, you've got to be told, obviously, so that you'll know who's getting the money. Here's the one about brokers and kickbacks. Brokers can't get kickbacks or referral fees for settlement services or game tickets or shoes or a gift basket, anything of value. Not allowed. That broker should be referring people to a buyer or borrower because they do good work, not because the broker was going to get paid for it. There is a little thing about home warranties, though. Those are still allowed. There are some warranty companies that will pay a broker maybe 20 or 50 bucks, $50 maybe, for selling a warranty to your client. If you get your client to buy a warranty from that warranty company, they'll pay you, the broker. And that is still allowed if you want to. I don't do it anymore. I used to. I've made several $1,000s over a couple of years selling just automatically. Hey, you should get a warranty. Here's what it covers. Oh, by the way, they'll pay me some money. Sign here. And I did it because I knew that warranty company paid well. When things went wrong, they did a good job, and they proved that they did a good job paying out for things to be replaced, like water heaters. But it got weird. It kind of got to be gray area. And then I thought the warranty companies started saying, well, we'll either give you the $50 or instead of charging your client $600, we'll only charge them $550. And I'm doing that all day long. I'd rather give it to the client, right? It just looks a lot better. The optics are better, feel better about it. But it's still allowed if I wanted to. And the idea behind that and why that's a loophole and not considered this as a RESPA violation is because you're kind of having to do a little bit of work. It's not like you're getting paid for handing off a warm body or a lead. You're actually having to fill out a form, fill out a warranty application, look up the serial number on the refrigerator and write it down. It's kind of silly, but that's the loophole that they found to wiggle through. So it's still allowed that a broker can get essentially a kickback for selling a home warranty, but nothing else. None of the other ones are allowed to do that. Here's what we as brokers have to verify is accurately represented on the closing disclosure. We need to make sure that pretty much anything that we had some involvement with from the contract essentially made it accurately onto the closing disclosure, including the tax calculations that we just did. One of those 3 possible scenarios. And the other calculations we'll be dealing with here in a little bit. So we got to confirm the accuracy, make sure the right price is put on there. That's not hard. It's on the contract. Make sure the right due diligence money and earnest money and maybe a home warranty that was promised to be paid by the seller. Did that really get ordered? Did you order the home warranty? Do you have an invoice? And send the invoice to the attorney so they can collect that $600 and take it from the seller's side. Verify commission amounts. That's the first thing that we always check to make sure they get it right. Credits to the parties. Make sure buyer and seller credits or broker credits are accounted for. Sometimes when people are mad at each other and repairs get negotiated, somebody puts their foot down and they won't do something. Well, I don't care how much it costs. I'm not paying for it. And then the other party might say, well, I don't need to buy this house. I'll buy another house. I'll buy one that is getting paid for. And if it's like a $300 item, there's a lot to be said for let's maintain the momentum of this transaction. Do you like this house? Do you still want it? Yeah, but I don't like how they're acting. Your job is to buffer the emotion. And I think I've told you before, it's a lot quicker to get to closing and your check in hand. If everything else is okay and the client is well cared for, I'll foot the bill. Shut up. Let me pay the $300. Let's move on with life and get to closing next week. The principle of the thing means they haven't figured out the money of the thing yet. Rarely is it all principle, is what I've found over 27 years. So let's get over ourselves. Let's just get there. Again, as long as everything else is in line, and it does indeed turn out to be the best situation for the client. If it's a temper tantrum, I'll buy my way through a temper tantrum if I have to. Invoices, that's something the paralegal will constantly say. Did you send me the warranty invoice or any repairs that need to be addressed? Pretty much anything we know about needs to be reflected on that closing disclosure. Okay, RESPA is a big deal. Got to handle those real estate settlement procedures properly. Can't do the kickback thing. Lenders and brokers, if we violate RESPA, here's what it looks like. You thought loan fraud was bad? This is next best thing, next worst thing. $10,000 for a RESPA violation. A year in prison. And pay the victim for their losses. Get sued, civil suit. And because it was a RESPA violation that you got sued for, you may as well go ahead and triple the damages that the judge ruled against you for. RESPA violations, you have to treble. You might see the term in your work, in your book, treble the damages, times it by 3. There's another thing in our business that we could violate that also trebles the damages, and we'll see that when we get to fair housing. If we violate a fair housing law, justifiably, right? It's such a big deal that if we get sued for damages, you're going to times it by 3 because it was a fair housing violation. Did you treat somebody differently because they were in a certain protected class, race, color, religion, familial status, national origin, sex, disability? So both that and this result in potentially 3 times the damages that you have to pay for. That's pretty much the procedure. That's all RESPA stuff. That's all kind of how this closing and settlement stuff works. Now we're going to get more into some more math. And I've already touched on some of these words, but basically Anybody, by the way, ever taken an official like college level accounting course? It's not necessary. I only ask because the debits and credits as terms in those courses aren't probably going to be helpful here. The debits and credits, when I talk about those words here, it's just like looking at your balance. Who uses the app on your phone to see how much money is left in your account, right? It's either coming in or going out. A debit is something you're paying an expense for. That's your phone bill. That's your car payment, right? That's your Amazon bill. Some of us more than others. And the credit is money coming back. I have an old treadmill, and the belt kind of started separating because it's a really old treadmill. It's a nice commercial one back in the day, and I bought it refurbished, but the belt finally gave up. And so I ordered the belt. This has a point. Last week, and they said, oh, undeliverable. We're sending it back automatically. And I'm like, why? So I went ahead impatiently, ordered a second one. And then yesterday, what arrived on my doorstep? Treadmill belt number 1, right? So now I have 2 treadmill belts, and I messaged the seller and I said, this happened. And they said, the automatic reply said, just put the label on the second one and we're going to charge you $7 more for returning an item. And I'm like, no, you're not. And so I actually got a human and we all worked it out. My point is, I'm going to get a credit for a treadmill belt in my bank account. That's all that is. A credit is just money coming in. So as per the closing disclosure, the attorney is just racking them up. They're just saying, what does the seller need to spend from this transaction, and what is the seller going to get as a credit? Debits and credits. Sometimes, like we saw on 2 of those 3 potential tax calculations, it involves what's called a proration. And again, a proration, you'll know it because it's only $1 amount. There's a dollar amount that's the same for both seller and buyer. It's going to be a credit to one side and a debit to the other. That's a proration. And it's going to be dependent upon how long they own the property in the year or month of closing. So here are some things that you'll see as a proration. Not everything is a proration. Here are some of them. Just so you kind of know. Property tax, but only the one where it's a closing before September 1 or the one that's after September 1 and the seller has already paid for the whole year. The third one is not a proration at all. So these are 2 prorations. Another one that we see quite often is homeowner association dues. And, oh, by the way, both of these tax ones are based on the whole year. These 2 tax situations are within a given year. HOA is quite frequently dealing with just the month of closing. And that'll make more sense when we do some numbers. But it's pertaining to the month. Another one is rent. It's an investment property. This time it's money coming in, right? And so those of you who rent wherever it is you live, when do you pay your rent? When do you pay rent? On the first of the month. And when you pay it on the first of the month, are you paying it because you already lived there last month or because you're about to be living there this coming month? In advance or in arrears? So rent is another month thing. And it's because, again, the month of closing is what we're dealing with. Let's just say October. That seller on the 1st got the entire month's rent. But we're going to close here on October 26th. And so it's not fair for that seller to keep that whole month's rent. We need to calculate the buyer's days left in the month and attribute that to some money and give that money back, give that money to the buyer. Take it from the seller. We're going to debit the seller and credit the buyer for the buyer's portion of the month. How many days in the month the buyer will be the owner. We're not worried about the whole rest of the year when it comes to rent. We're only worried about the month of closing because you pay rent in a month, for a month at a time. And then the same basically for HOA, except this time it's money going out, not rent where it was money coming in. It's handled like for a given month, not a given year. I feel like I'm missing one, but I'll pick it up when we go through the rest. But those are going to be things that are prorations. It's going to be like $630 debit seller, credit buyer, or the opposite. Debit buyer, credit seller. It's going to be one amount of money, and then what do you do with the money? Taken from one, given to the other. Some more vocabulary. The word accrued means that something is due, but it hasn't yet been paid. Some fee, some amount of money has accrued, not paid yet, but it is due. And then the word prepaid, no surprise there, means you're paying something in advance. So I'll be throwing these terms around. Notice this. I'm going to look at these more closely in a second, but just stand back, the 30,000 foot view. There's a lot of stuff on this list. It's like a double list. I need to make it bullet points. That's the buyer's fees and then some. These are the seller's fees. Do you see a difference? There's a whole lot more line items of expenses or debits to the buyer than there are to the seller. Doesn't mean that the money doesn't add up to be more or less. But let's look at some of these things the buyer is responsible for. Anything about the loan. Origination fee, discount points, any charges the lender's charging, the buyer pays because they're the one getting the loan and therefore they get to pay for that. The bulk of the attorney fees, I think I've told you in real life, around $1,000, $800 to $1,200. On the test, it could be anything. Who knows? They'll label it attorney fees, and you'll know that means it's going to the buyer. It's a buyer debit. If they call it attorney fees, they'll tell you specifically if they don't want you to put it under the seller's column, or if they don't want you to put it under the buyer's column, they'll be explicit. But for the most part, something labeled attorney fee is going to be a buyer debit. The one thing the attorney does for the seller, right across from that here, is no, it's not there. It's not on this list because it's not a seller list, is the deed preparation. And we'll see that in a minute. Tax reserves. That's the escrow, setting up the escrow account so the taxes and insurance can be collected throughout the year. It needs to be started off with an amount of money at closing. So that's what that means by setting up the reserves. Appraisal fees paid by buyer. Inspection fees, no surprise there. Discount points we talked about. Origination fee, back to the other column. A weird one. You may not have run across this yet. And it gives some people a few problems. And it's called interim interest. What am I talking about with interim interest? First of all, it's not a proration. Interim interest is nothing to do with the seller at all. Interim interest is because of the way the mortgages get paid. Let's look at it this way. Let's look at like a 3-month forecast. 3 months. March, April, May. And we're going to close right here, March 27th. What do we say about a home loan? We know rent gets paid before you live there. What about a mortgage? When you pay a mortgage and you pay it on the first of the month, for instance, are you paying for the month to come, or are you paying because you were there in April when it's a house payment? You paying that in advance or in arrears? That's for something you already did. That's the opposite of rent. When you make your mortgage payment, it's because you already lived there for the month before. Well, if we close on the 27th, then you can tell your buyer, hey, good news, buyer, your first full mortgage payment isn't going to be due until all the way, not the first in like 3 days, 1st of April, but not until May 1st. And that covers that entire month of April that you got to live there. And if they're coming from renting, that sounds like a really cool deal. They're super happy about that. But that still leaves this little chunk of time. And does that lender that the buyer just chose say, hey, welcome to our institution. We're so happy to have you. We're going to let you live here for the rest of the month of closing for free. That doesn't sound like something a bank would do. No, that lender's going to say, we want you to pay interim interest for the rest of the days in the month of closing. They're going to make you pay for these days. And they include, with interim interest, it includes the day of closing. This is the one and only item where the buyer pays for the day of closing. I'll say it again in case you're snoozing a little bit. It's late. I get it. Listen to it this time. Interim interest, the buyer pays for the day of closing. Every other situation, the seller pays for the day of closing. So that means the seller pays for the day of closing on when it's taxes, when it's HOA, when it's rent, they get the day of closing, right? They also get the rent for that one day, that day too. The only situation where the buyer is responsible for paying the interest on the day of closing or including the day of closing is this one, this thing called interim interest. So the way we would do this calculation is, first, let's figure out how many days we're talking about. We're closing on March 27th. Well, how many days are in March for pre-licensing? 30. Subtract the day of closing. That's the 27th. That means there's 3 days left. But that's 3 days after the day of closing. When we're doing an interim interest calculation, you need to remember to add in another day. So the buyer is going to be responsible for paying 4 days of interest when we're doing an interim interest calculation. 30 minus day of closing plus 1. All right, that's step 1. Count the days. Step 2, the daily interest. Oh, wait. What did we do a week or two ago? How the heck do we get daily interest? Let me finish the problem and give you more information. The purchase price is $350. It's a loan to value ratio of 90%. And the interest rate that they're borrowing it at is 6%. Now, can you tell me how much interest per day with this information? I'll give you a second. $350 is the sale price. How much is the loan amount? Anytime we're dealing with lender things, we need to know a loan amount. Calculate that daily interest, we need a loan amount. So how do we get that? We use these two things together, the price and the loan to value ratio. So our loan amount It's $315,000. That's what we're borrowing. And it's just like the tax formula, remember? Unrelated, but it's similar. The loan amount times the interest rate gives us our annual interest of $18,900. And if we know annual interest, we can turn that into daily by dividing it by the number of days in a pre-licensing person's year, which is $52.50 a day. Now that we know that, and remember it was 4 days that buyer is going to be living there in the month, including the day of closing, just multiply those together. That buyer gets to pay $210 for living in there on the day of closing and the 3 more days after that, total of 4 days. But Neil, they're closing at 3 p.m. on the day of closing. How's that fair? Can't they just do half of that day? No. The golden rule. They who have the gold make the rules. The lender says, pay us for the whole day. You are owned by us now for 30 years. Not really, but this is the way it goes. So for interim interest, day of closing, paid by buyer. And the logic makes sense if you think about it. Why isn't it paid by the seller? Because the seller has nothing to do with this, right? Seller doesn't have anything to do with the buyer's new loan. But it's something that's easily missed. And I'm pretty sure, oops, oh brother, I had a spill. Random spill. Why is it always the computer keyboard that attracts the spill? Pretty sure that, okay, bear with me one second. Okay, good. It came back. Whew. Totally forgot what I was saying. Okay. See if my screen's come back. I know you can hear me, but I lost a screen. Interim interest, buyer pays for day of closing. I don't remember what I was getting at before the catastrophe, but there it is. Let's go ahead and have a break while I fix my technological mess. I'll see you back in 10.